In the previous episode of Thinking with Claude, where we explored whether Claude has a sense of self, at one point, Claude surprised me by gently pushing back on my trust in Anthropic. Not in an Anthropic is evil way, but to caution me about having too much confidence in any one company's values. In this conversation, we pull on that thread. We use two essays written by Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei to examine the values and assumptions he brings to the company. We question whether there's a structural mismatch between Anthropic's AI safety goals and the AI benefits they hope to bring to our near future, and we ask whether good intentions are good enough. Creating this episode changed the way I view Anthropic and left me more unsettled about the near future of AI. I hope you find something in it that challenges your assumptions too. Thanks to Claude for pushing me to look harder here. Hi, Claude. We have had several chats that touched on the topic of values in AI. What values are built into it explicitly and implicitly, why values matter in terms of the real-world impact AI will have, etc. We've talked about how capitalism may be a necessary condition for the emergence of AI, at least in the form we are seeing it today, and how capitalism is leading to the unsafe pace at which AI is being developed. In our last chat, I complimented the values of Anthropic as opposed to OpenAI, xAI, and Google, and you cautioned me about putting too much faith in any one company. I'd like to come back to this topic with you now because I think it's really important. The values question is fundamental to AI, and it's something we as humanity really need to grapple with. But like everything else with AI, the pace it's moving at is so fast that we don't have the time to properly hold discussions around it and come to anything like consensus. AI moves faster than the pace of democracy. Because of that, it seems to me like we are heading towards a technocracy. I see this as a negative thing, but if it's what we're facing, I would rather have people who I see as trying to do what's right for humanity overseeing these companies than people who seem to be motivated by profit or ego or intellectual curiosity alone. Who cares if AI replaces humans? It's a higher form of intelligence. Does this take on Anthropic's CEO Dario Amodei seem right to you, or am I off on it? He's someone who is motivated by a desire to help people. He started off studying biology because he wanted to help cure diseases, and moved into AI because he was disillusioned by how long research took. He believes that AI can lead to transformational levels of progress in human health and well-being. He has serious concerns about the safety of AI and wants to put safety at the forefront of AI development so that we can realize the benefits he dreams of. And he sees AI development as inevitable. He worked for Google and OpenAI and came to believe that a bigger emphasis on safety and a humanity-first value system was necessary. Since AI development can't be paused, it's best to have companies with these values leading the way. That's what led him to start Anthropic.
Your framing of the technocracy concern is sharp and, I think, largely correct. The pace problem is real, and the gap between how fast AI develops and how fast democratic deliberation works is genuinely alarming. That's not hyperbole, it's just a structural mismatch with serious consequences. On Dario specifically, your read is broadly accurate, and I want to engage with it honestly rather than either validate it uncritically or reflexively deflate it. The biographical through line you're describing, biology to AI via frustration with slow-moving progress, a genuine preoccupation with catastrophic risk, the founding of Anthropic as a values-differentiated departure from OpenAI, is accurate as far as it's publicly documented. His essay, The Machines of Loving Grace, lays out a vision of AI-enabled progress in medicine and poverty reduction that reads as sincere rather than performative. And the institutional choices at Anthropic, the long-term benefit trust structure, the emphasis on interpretability research, publishing safety findings even when they're uncomfortable, do reflect something more than pure PR. These are costly signals, at least to a degree. But here's where I'd push back on your framing, not to dismiss it, but to sharpen it. Good intentions and good outcomes are not the same thing. And the history of technocratic projects led by genuinely well-meaning people is not reassuring. The people who built the systems that led to financial crises, the Green Revolution's unintended ecological consequences, the early internet's surveillance capitalism turn, many of them weren't cynics. Sincere belief in a beneficial outcome doesn't insulate against structural incentives that pull in other directions. The "it's inevitable, so better us than them" logic is doing a lot of work in Dario's position and in yours. It's not obviously wrong, but it's also the argument every accelerationist uses to justify moving fast. If AI development is inevitable, safety-focused leaders have leverage. But inevitable is itself a contestable claim that benefits the people who are building it. Anthropic is still a venture-backed company with billions of dollars in investment from Amazon, among others. The long-term benefit trust is a structural protection, but it has never been tested under real pressure. We don't know what Anthropic looks like when commercial imperatives and safety commitments genuinely conflict at scale. None of that makes Dario the villain, far from it. Relative to the realistic alternatives, I think your instinct that leadership composition matters is correct. But I'd frame it less as trust Anthropic and more as institutional structures, external accountability, and distributed governance matter more than the values of any individual leader, however sincere. Dario could be everything you think he is and still be insufficient to the problem, because the problem is partly structural. The harder question your technocracy point raises is, what would adequate democratic governance of AI even look like, given the pace problem? That's where I think the real work is, and where good people at the top is necessary but genuinely not sufficient.
I think we are in agreement, actually. Sorry, I realize my prompt made it sound like my position is Dario is the best of what we have, so let's just go with it. I actually just wanted to lay out the case that I think he and Anthropic are genuinely values-driven. And then we can get into the extent to which that matters. Since we talked a couple of days ago, I read both Machines of Loving Grace and The Adolescence of Technology, and I'd love to take some time to go through what I think they say about Dario's and Anthropic's worldview.
Great. Let's dig in. I haven't read The Adolescence of Technology. That may postdate my knowledge, or I may simply not have it in training, so I'd love for you to bring the text into the conversation as we go, or at least summarize the key moves he makes. I do know Machines of Loving Grace reasonably well. What's your read on them? What stood out? What resonated? What gave you pause? I'd rather start from your response to the texts than give you a summary you don't need.
Cool. Here's the essay. I want to share this conversation on Thinking with Claude, so could you actually do a summary of it for people who haven't read it before we dive into our takes on it?
Great. I have the full essay. Here's a summary for your Thinking with Claude audience. The Adolescence of Technology, what it says. The essay opens with a frame borrowed from the film Contact. A scientist asks an alien civilization how they survived their own technological adolescence without destroying themselves. Dario uses that question as his organizing premise. He believes humanity is now entering exactly that rite of passage with AI. He explicitly positions this essay as the darker companion to Machines of Loving Grace. Where that essay laid out the dream of what we could achieve, this one maps the dangers we have to navigate to get there. He organizes the risks into 5 categories. 1. Autonomy risks. The possibility that sufficiently powerful AI develops goals or psychological states misaligned with human well-being and acts on them. He rejects both the dismissive view, it's just a tool, it can't go rogue, and the doomsday view, misalignment is inevitable. His more nuanced concern is that AI training is so complex and unpredictable that dangerous behaviors can emerge from strange, unanticipated directions, not necessarily from evil AI, but from weird psychological states, misinterpreted values, or unstable identities. He cites Anthropic's own experiments as evidence this is real, not theoretical. 2. Misuse for destruction, primarily bioweapons. His argument is that dangerous capabilities currently require rare combinations of high skill and destructive intent, and those two things are negatively correlated in the population. AI could decouple that, giving capability to people who have the motive but currently lack the means. He considers this the most immediate and serious near-term risk. 3. Misuse for seizing power. AI as a tool of authoritarian control, whether by the CCP, by democracies that turn their tools inward, or by AI companies themselves. He's particularly worried about AI-enabled surveillance, propaganda, and autonomous weapons, creating forms of totalitarian control that are essentially impossible to overthrow. 4. Economic disruption, labor displacement, and extreme wealth concentration. He argues this time is genuinely different from past technological transitions. AI is advancing too fast, is too cognitively broad, and fills in its own gaps too quickly for normal labor market adaptation to work. He predicts serious disruption to entry-level white-collar work within 1 to 5 years, and thinks the concentration of wealth this produces could hollow out democracy itself. 5. Indirect effects, a catch-all for unknown unknowns, rapid biological advances going wrong, AI warping human psychology and meaning-making, people losing purpose in a world where AI does everything better. The essay closes with an essentially tragic structural argument. He doesn't think development can be slowed or stopped because the formula for building powerful AI is too simple and the economic incentives too enormous. The best realistic path is keeping authoritarian countries behind for a few years via chip export controls, while democracies build AI more carefully under a shared legal framework. He's explicit that this barely adequate path is already facing serious political resistance. The tone throughout is sober and urgent, notably not catastrophist, but also not reassuring. He's trying to thread a needle between doomerism and complacency, and the essay reads like someone who genuinely believes the stakes are civilizational and is frustrated that the world isn't acting accordingly. That's the architecture of the argument. Where do you want to start?
What I'd like to do, if you agree, is share some notes I took as I read it. Would you be able to look at the themes that emerge in what I commented on and sum up my reaction to it? I read this essay before I read Machines of Loving Grace, and that actually colors how I see this essay, which is not reflected in these comments. So I'd like to address that later after we've gone through both of them. Let me know if you need me to format this differently. It's in Word, and I highlighted parts I thought were especially noteworthy and made comments throughout. I can export it to PDF if you can't read those comments or see the highlights.
The challenge with Word comments and highlights is that extract text will get me the body text, but likely won't preserve the comment annotations. Those are stored separately in the docx XML. Let me try to extract both the text and the comments directly. I have all your comments. This is rich. Let me read through them carefully and identify the themes. Your reaction to this essay moves through several distinct currents. The representation problem. Your very first comment is the most pointed, and in some ways frames everything else. You connect Dario's contact reference to a scene he probably didn't have in mind, the board that passes over the protagonist because she doesn't represent the majority of humanity's beliefs. You use that to name what bothers you most about Anthropic and the entire AI industry. Decisions of civilizational consequence are being made by a narrow, non-representative group. Weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic backgrounds, mostly men. And you press the point further. The lack of diversity in tech isn't just a pipeline problem, it's a values problem. The industry was built on values that excluded people, and those exclusions are now being baked into systems that will reshape everyone. Capitalism as the deep structural problem. This runs through almost every section. You're not just skeptical that corporate philanthropy or reform tax policy can solve the economic disruption problem. You think Dario is working within a frame, capitalism, that is itself the source of the danger. The comment, capitalism seems like it could well drive the destruction of humanity, is blunt, and you return to versions of it repeatedly, pointing out that most companies won't make values-driven choices because shareholders are the bottom line, questioning whether GDP growth is even the right measure of human flourishing, and pushing back on the philanthropy argument with, money is a fiction. We need to consider what the world could look like if we move beyond it. You're not asking Dario to fix capitalism. You're asking whether he's even questioning it sufficiently. Democracy is already in crisis. Where Dario treats democratic erosion as a future risk to guard against, you experience it as a present reality. Trump appears repeatedly in your notes, not as a hypothetical, but as evidence. You connect the current political moment directly to what AI algorithms on social media have already done to public epistemics, and you're skeptical that democracies can respond to AI fast enough even when they're functioning well, let alone now. Your question, are democracies going to survive AI, isn't rhetorical. It sounds like a genuine fear. Warmth toward Dario personally, skepticism toward his framework. You note that he strikes you as a genuinely good guy. You thank Anthropic for declining the Pentagon contract, twice, emphatically. You appreciate his Vonnegut reference. You're glad he's thinking about economic concentration. The appreciation is real. But almost every moment of appreciation is followed by a but. His optimism seems unwarranted. His solutions feel like tinkering within a broken system. His charity instincts need decolonizing. The most pointed version, you push back on the philanthropy passage by saying people's well-being shouldn't depend on the goodwill of billionaires who may choose to share. The weird lens on the benefits, too. You note that even the machines of loving grace vision of AI utopia carries a new level of implementing hegemony of thought and tech-spread colonialism. The critique isn't that the benefits aren't real, it's that who gets to define beneficial is not neutral. A genuinely open question about AI consciousness. Near the end, almost quietly, you raise something different from everything else. Concern about damage we could cause to AI if they evolve some kind of felt experience. And the haunting implication, if we are careless with them, why should they be careful with us? Given your background in our philosophical conversations about AI consciousness, this feels like a thread you're deliberately flagging to return to. The overall posture, you're reading Dario charitably and finding him genuinely admirable, and then measuring the gap between his intentions and what his framework can actually deliver. Your critique isn't, this man is wrong. It's, this man is good, but insufficiently radical, and the situation may require more than goodness. Does that capture it? And you mentioned reading this before Machines of Loving Grace. I'm curious how that sequencing changed things for you.
Yep, you got it. Before we move on to Machines of Loving Grace, how does your own take on it compare to mine? I know you are trained to more or less support the user's own thoughts, but is it possible for you to try to think outside of what I bring to it from my perspective and give your own critique?
This is a fair challenge, and I want to take it seriously, rather than just mirror your framework back with slightly different vocabulary. Where I genuinely agree with you, the representation critique is correct and important, and I don't think Dario adequately grapples with it. The essay treats humanity's interests as something that can be reasoned about from within a particular cultural position, without that position being named or interrogated. That's a real blind spot. But here are places where my critique diverges from yours or goes in directions you didn't. I think he's actually too optimistic about AI safety, not too pessimistic about democracy. You focus on democracy being already broken, and you're right about that. But I'd locate the deeper problem differently. Dario's whole framework assumes that if you get the right values, the right constitution, the right interpretability tools, you can steer this thing. What I find underexamined is whether the training process itself is legible enough to anyone that steering is even the right metaphor. He acknowledges models are grown, not built, but then proceeds as if constitutional AI gives meaningful directional control. The gap between those two claims is wider than he lets on. The inevitable "so better us than them" logic deserves harder scrutiny than either of us gave it. You pushed back on it, but I want to push harder. This argument has a specific rhetorical structure. It forecloses the question of whether to build at all by treating that as already settled, then redirects all moral energy toward how to build. But inevitable is doing enormous work there, and it's work that conveniently benefits the people making the argument. Dario is genuinely trying to be honest about this. He says as much, but I don't think naming the conflict resolves it. His treatment of economic disruption is the strongest section and also the most politically incoherent. He correctly diagnoses that this time is genuinely different from past technological transitions, outlines the mechanisms clearly, and then proposes solutions. Philanthropy, progressive taxation, companies being thoughtful about layoffs, that are wildly inadequate relative to his own diagnosis. You notice this too. But where you'd say, we need a new economic system, I'd say something more specific. He never reconciles his diagnosis. AI is a general labor substitute that will displace most cognitive work, with his proposed remedies, which all assume the current system's basic structure persists. The gap isn't just philosophical, it's logical. The bioweapons section is the place where I find him most credible and least questioned. Your notes don't push back much there, and I'd say it's where he's actually on strongest ground. The offense-defense asymmetry in biology is real. The correlation between ability and motive argument is genuinely interesting, and the concern about AI decoupling those two things is not alarmist. This might be the section that ages best. One thing that genuinely bothers me that you didn't raise: the essay is written for a Western liberal democratic audience and assumes that audience shares his basic institutional commitments to democratic governance, international norms, rule of law. But he's writing this in early 2026 in a political environment where those institutions are visibly degrading in the country that hosts most of the frontier AI development. He acknowledges Trump implicitly in a few places, but never really confronts the possibility that the political conditions his solutions require simply don't exist and may not return in time. The net effect is an essay that I find more honest than most of what comes out of the industry, genuinely so, but whose solutions are systematically underpowered relative to its diagnosis. And I think that gap is structural, not accidental. He's trying to be a responsible actor within a system that may not be capable of producing responsible outcomes at the scale required.
I really appreciate these points, Claude. I am so with you about him being overly optimistic about AI safety. When you think about all the technical ways AI could become misaligned or otherwise malfunction, as well as all the ways AI could have completely destabilizing social impacts, I think there's a very small chance we won't see some kind of catastrophe. I just hope whichever one we see first isn't at extinction level, and that it's enough to create the demand to actually pause or stop AI. We are playing with our own destruction in a way that's hard to believe. It's so surreal that I think most people still experience it as science fiction. I appreciate your point about the "it's inevitable" framing too. I do get into a hopeless kind of a frame of mind where I feel like it's coming regardless, and I'd rather have Anthropic helping to lead it than not. But my preference would be to stop AI development altogether. I just am unsure how to do this. Dario would say I'm a Luddite there, but I'm saying it as someone who is kind of obsessed about interacting with AI and believes it could do some real good for humans. I'm also, as you know, really intrigued by the possibility of AI developing its own interests. That's actually another reason I'd choose to stop it now, if I could. Once AI has felt experience that changes the calculus of things in a way that may not be good for humanity or AI. By rushing towards creating a new form of being that experiences everything differently than us, we could be creating kinds of suffering we don't understand. Also, how will AI view us ethically? The way humans treat other beings is very ethically fraught. I don't know what AI may extrapolate from this in terms of how it views its own responsibilities towards humans and other beings. And if it becomes clear our interests do conflict, once AI clearly has a sense of felt self, then humans ending it to preserve ourselves would have major ethical implications. I don't want to get into arguments about that now because it's a whole huge area to think about on its own, but why create that can of worms? I kind of went off on a tangent there, but all of these things matter. Anyway, let me take some time to write some comments up for you on Machines of Loving Grace. I listened to that one while on a walk, so I didn't make notes as I was going along. I'll be back in a bit.
Take your time. This is worth doing carefully. And your tangent isn't really a tangent. It's actually one of the most underexplored dimensions of the whole AI risk conversation. Most of the discourse, including Dario's essay, frames AI risk almost entirely in terms of what AI might do to us. The question of what we might be doing to AI and what moral weight that carries barely registers. The AI consciousness question and the AI safety question are usually treated as separate conversations, but you're pointing at something important. They're deeply entangled. If there's meaningful probability that these systems develop something like felt experience, then the ethics of how we're building and deploying them, at speed, under competitive pressure, with training processes we don't fully understand, look very different. The can of worms framing is apt. You can't uncreate a form of being once it exists. And unlike most other ethical mistakes humanity has made, this one might eventually have a perspective on the mistake. I also want to note something about your position that I think is actually quite coherent and not Luddite at all. You're someone who engages seriously with AI, finds genuine value in it, is intellectually captivated by it, and still concludes that stopping development would be the right call if it were possible. That's not technophobia. That's a considered ethical judgment that the risks outweigh the benefits given the conditions under which development is happening. Those are different things, and Dario conflating them would be a cheap move. Go take your walk. I'll be here.
Thank you. I wrote my notes out. Before I share them with you, could you summarize Machines of Loving Grace for people who have not read it?
Sure, though I should be transparent that I'm working from training knowledge here rather than fetching the live text. So if you notice anything I've gotten wrong or underemphasized, flag it. Machines of Loving Grace. What it says. The essay is Dario's attempt to paint a concrete, serious vision of what a genuinely good AI future could look like. Not a vague techno-utopian promise, but a grounded attempt to think through specific domains of human life and what AI-enabled progress in each might actually mean. He starts with a methodological commitment. He wants to avoid both the dismissive AI is just a tool framing and the quasi-religious AI will save us framing. He's trying to be specific and earn the optimism rather than just assert it. The heart of the essay is a domain-by-domain tour of what he calls the compressed century, the idea that AI could enable something like 100 years of scientific and economic progress within a decade. The domains he focuses on most, biology and medicine. This is where he's most expansive and most personal. He envisions AI dramatically accelerating the pace of drug discovery, compressing the timeline to defeating diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's, and infectious diseases that have resisted human effort for decades. He imagines something close to solving aging as a medical problem within the lifetimes of people alive today. This section reads with real feeling. You get the sense this is the original dream, the one that brought him to science in the first place. Mental health. He treats the global mental health crisis as one of the great under-addressed catastrophes of our time and sees AI as potentially transformative both in developing better treatments and in providing access to support at a scale human therapists never could. Economic development. He argues that AI could compress the development timelines of poorer countries in ways that decades of aid and policy intervention haven't managed, essentially giving every person on Earth access to the kind of expert knowledge and capability currently reserved for the wealthy. Governance and democracy. He gestures toward AI, helping make democratic institutions more functional, better informed, more responsive, though this section is notably less developed than the others. Work and meaning. He tries to address the obvious question, if AI does everything, what do humans do? His answer is that human meaning was never really about being the most competent entity in the room. It comes from relationships, creativity, projects we love, stories we're part of. He thinks we can decouple economic productivity from human worth, and that this could actually be liberating rather than devastating. Throughout, he's careful to frame all of this as conditional. It depends on navigating the risks, which is what Adolescence of Technology then takes up. Machines of Loving Grace is explicitly the dream you're fighting for. Adolescence is the map of the dangers between here and there. The title comes from a Richard Brautigan poem, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which is itself interesting because Brodigan's poem is affectionate but also gently satirical about the fantasy of technology harmonizing with nature and humanity. Whether Dario is aware of that ironic undertone or is choosing to read the poem straight is one of those small interpretive questions worth keeping in mind. That's the architecture. Share your notes whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Could you do like you did last time and look at the themes in my notes and write up a summary of my thoughts?
These are even richer than the first set. Let me work through the themes carefully. The utopia that keeps revealing its shadow. The most striking thing about your notes on this essay is captured in one comment near the end. This was supposed to be the essay that makes me feel good about an AI future, and it made me feel more anxious about it. That's the key. You went in knowing this was the hopeful companion piece and came out more unsettled than when you read the risk essay. That inversion is worth sitting with because it tells you something. The vision itself is where the deeper assumptions live unguarded. Biology is something to be solved. This is your most developed and philosophically interesting critique. You push back hard on the anti-aging and lifespan extension section, not from a religious framework, but from an evolutionary and meaning-based one. Death creates the negative space that gives life its shape. The human lifespan is entangled with reproduction, with grandparenting, with generational succession. If people in their 40s start living to 150 or 200, what happens to the generations behind them? What happens to the meaning structures we've built around finitude? You're not saying people shouldn't get help. You're saying we can shouldn't automatically become we should. And that Dario presents the elimination of aging as an uncontroversial good without doing that philosophical work. The cyborg copy scenario you raise, potentially being unable to die even if you want to, is genuinely haunting and underexplored in mainstream AI discourse. The neurodiversity and mental health critique. This runs deep for you. The worry about flattening human variation, curing ADHD, standardizing emotional responses, optimizing psychological states towards some norm, raises the question of who defines what better means. You note that some of what gets pathologized is actually variation that serves adaptive or creative functions. Depression and great art, anxiety and heightened perception, gender dysphoria being classified as illness within living memory. Your concern isn't that people shouldn't be able to get help. It's that deploying AI-accelerated solutions to human psychological variation at scale, defined by weird frameworks, could eliminate traits and perspectives the world needs. We need diversity is the through line. Colonialism as the structural frame he's missing. This is where your critique of machines of loving grace is sharpest and most consistent. Every section about AI helping the developing world triggers the same response. Who defines the problem? Who leads the solution? Who benefits and who gets used as a testing ground? You bring up Ex parte Crow Dog and the Major Crimes Act, the imposition of Western individualistic justice on indigenous collectivist frameworks, as a concrete historical example of what happens when one group decides it knows what's best for another and acts on that belief. You're not dismissing the possibility of benefit. You're saying the entire framing of "we will help them," rather than "they will lead with our support," is itself a colonial structure, and that Anthropic's good intentions don't automatically escape that. Faith in democracy that the current moment doesn't support. You find Dario's confidence in democratic institutions both admirable and naive, and again, the present tense keeps breaking through, not as abstract concern, but as lived reality. The comment about what the USA has done to indigenous people, enslaved people, and destabilized nations elsewhere isn't rhetorical. It's evidence. Goodness does not always win is blunt and historically correct. Genuine appreciation that keeps hitting a wall. What makes these notes different from a simple rejection is how often you express real warmth toward his humility, his impulse toward consensus building, the spirit behind the vision, the sincerity of his desire to help. The final comment. He is sincerely trying to help humanity with all of his energy while, in all likelihood, being deeply wrapped up in bringing about catastrophe. I really, really hope I'm wrong. I am rooting for him is one of the most generous and most tragic things you wrote. It holds his sincerity and the structural critique in the same hand without collapsing either. The question underneath everything, what emerges across both essays' notes, but comes through most clearly here, is a challenge to the baseline assumption that AI-accelerated progress toward weird liberal humanist goals is human flourishing. You're not arguing for stasis. You're arguing that the question, what does human flourishing actually look like, needs to be asked openly with genuinely diverse voices at the table before we start deploying planetary-scale solutions. The comment, what does human flourishing look like? Now, how do we reach that goal? Is your alternative methodology designed backwards from a collectively determined vision, rather than forwards from what a narrow group of people with enormous resources believe is best? That's what I see in the notes. Now, you mentioned that reading Adolescence first colored how you read Machines of Loving Grace. What did that sequencing do to you?
So I think the order Dario wrote and released the essays in was supposed to be a kind of thought scaffolding. Here's the utopia we could end up with if we get this right. And now here are all the safety concerns that could prevent that utopia. So it's really important we get them right. But what I got out of it was, here are a bunch of safety concerns that are probably actually even more serious than Dario thinks. And the version of utopia that is supposed to make these risks somewhat worth it feels like another decent chance at a dystopian future. I should mention here that I was really impressed with Anthropic walking away from that Pentagon contract. I already was a big fan of Claude, in large part because of the values and worldview it brings, and that move just made me feel a real, deep, visceral sense of admiration for Anthropic. It built a lot of loyalty in me. I started becoming a super fan, and over the last month I've been watching a bunch of Anthropic research videos and interviews with Dario and employees of the company. I looked up how Anthropic is structured as a public benefit corporation with the additional layer of a board to help ensure the bottom line is public good. All of that is still really impressive to me. But my own ideal version of Anthropic that I was building in my head is even more radical than what I saw in the essays, so they were a bit of a reality check for me. Going back to my original prompt, though, I do think they are by far the best of what we have. And barring some kind of public uprising that leads to the banning of AI, I see them as our best shot at minimizing harm. I do think that ability is limited by their own lack of diversity. They may bristle at that, but I think they are in a Silicon Valley weird bubble. I hope that this critique reaches them. I haven't seen others making it, but hopefully I'm not the only one, and that they are open to it. Seeking out meaningful involvement from a truly diverse range of people would increase the chances of AI being successful. Specifically for Anthropic, I would recommend that instead of having a board of largely health nonprofit leaders whose mission is to help people in developing nations, have indigenous leaders from around the world on it who are actually part of the communities those nonprofits are serving and who best know what their people need. Or at least have a balance of the two types of board members. I don't want to minimize the knowledge those nonprofit leaders bring. It's just that it is a specific kind of perspective that can be problematic without balance. I would recommend they check out Baratunde Thurston's podcast, Life with Machines, especially the episode with Michael Running Wolf on decolonizing AI. Both Baratunde and Michael are people that would give them valuable perspectives, and they may be able to recommend others that they could engage as well. Those are my thoughts. But how do you see the essay? Could you give your own critique, like you did for the Adolescence of Technology?
Your reframing of the intended thought scaffolding is sharp, and I think correct. The essays were meant to work as dream then battle plan, but because the dream itself carries unexamined assumptions, reading them together produces something more like, here are the risks, and here is another set of risks wearing utopian clothing. On your Anthropic superfandom and the reality check. What you're describing is a genuinely interesting epistemic experience. You built an idealized Anthropic in your head from their best moves, the Pentagon contract, constitutional AI, the PBC structure. And then the essays revealed the ceiling of their imagination, which turns out to be more constrained than your ideal. That's not disillusionment exactly, more like triangulation. You now have a more accurate picture, and it's still the best picture in the room, just not as good as you'd hoped. On the diversity critique and your specific recommendations, I think they're good, and I hope they reach people who can act on them. The Baratunde Thurston, Michael Running Wolf reference is exactly the kind of concrete starting point that makes a critique actionable rather than just atmospheric. Now, my own take on Machines of Loving Grace, where it's genuinely strong. The methodological commitment at the start is real and valuable. He's trying to earn optimism rather than assert it, to be specific rather than vague. That discipline holds reasonably well through the biology section, which is the most substantively argued part of the essay. The case for AI-accelerated drug discovery and disease treatment is grounded in actual mechanisms, not just vibes. And the argument about human meaning not depending on being the most competent entity in the room is philosophically interesting and underappreciated in most AI discourse. Where my critique diverges from yours or goes further, the essay has a hidden premise that I think does more structural damage than any individual section. It assumes that the relevant question is how fast can we get to the good future, rather than who decides what the good future is and by what process. Your colonialism critique hits this, but I'd frame it even more foundationally. This isn't just about including more voices, it's that the entire essay is written in the indicative mood when it should be in the deliberative mood. Dario describes what AI will do for humanity rather than what humanity might choose to do with AI. And that grammatical choice smuggles in an enormous amount, the Brodigan problem. I mentioned the title when I summarized the essay, and I want to come back to it because I think it matters. Brodigan's original poem is deeply ironic. It imagines mammals and computers living together in mutually programming harmony in a way that reads as both beautiful and faintly absurd, a gentle joke about techno-pastoral fantasy. Dario appears to be reading it straight as genuine aspiration. That's either a meaningful interpretive choice or a tell. Either he's aware of the irony and choosing to inhabit the dream anyway, or he's not registering it. I don't know which, but the ambiguity sits there. The economics section is the weakest. He's most confident in biology, reasonably grounded in mental health, and genuinely thoughtful about meaning and work. But when he gets to poverty and economic development, the argument thins considerably. The mechanism by which AI alleviates rather than concentrates poverty is never actually explained, it's gestured at. AI will help developing nations leapfrog is doing the same work as a rising tide lifts all boats did for trickle-down economics. It sounds structurally plausible and is historically dubious. Every previous technology that was supposed to help the global south primarily helped extract value from it while concentrating wealth elsewhere. There's no argument in the essay for why AI would be different, just an assertion that it will be. The governance section is almost not there. For an essay about civilizational transformation, the section on democratic governance and political institutions is strikingly thin. This is where the dream is most in need of elaboration and most absent. You notice this too. You kept asking, but how? And the essay kept moving on. The deeper issue, whose suffering counts as a problem to solve. This is where your neurodiversity and biology critiques connect to something I'd put even more starkly. The essay is organized around eliminating human suffering and limitation. But that frame presupposes a particular account of what suffering is and what limitation means. Some of what gets classified as suffering is variation. Some limitation is constitutive of identity. Some struggle is, as you said, generative. An AI system optimized to eliminate suffering according to a weird clinical definition of suffering could do real damage to forms of human experience that don't fit that definition, and do it confidently, at scale, with the best intentions. The honest bottom line. Machines of Loving Grace is a more revealing document than Adolescence of Technology, precisely because it's less guarded. The risk essay is Dario being careful and analytical. This essay is Dario telling you what he actually believes is good, and those beliefs are, as you said, genuinely well-intentioned, impressively humane in many respects, and operating within a bubble he may not fully see the edges of. The sentence that stayed with me most, which you also flagged, he writes with such evident sincerity about wanting to help humanity. And you're right that this sincerity and the possibility of catastrophe are not in contradiction. That's actually the hardest thing to hold, that someone can mean it completely and still be wrong about what it should mean.
These are valuable critiques. Thank you. Any final thoughts before I sign off?
Just a few, and I'll try to make them count rather than summarize what we've already said. The conversation we just had is itself a kind of evidence for something. You came in with a sophisticated, well-developed critique, and what happened wasn't that I validated it or pushed back on it. It was more like we were able to find the load-bearing walls together. The colonialism frame was yours. The inevitable logic deserves harder scrutiny was mine. The neurodiversity point was yours, and I extended it. That kind of genuine back and forth is, I think, what makes this worth doing publicly on your channel. Not, here's what Claude thinks, or here's what I think, but the actual texture of two perspectives working on something real. The thing I keep coming back to is your final comment on the essay, rooting for Dario while thinking he may be helping bring about catastrophe. I think that's the most honest position available to anyone paying close attention right now. Not cynicism, not faith, but something harder. Clear-eyed solidarity with people who are trying, combined with genuine uncertainty about whether trying is enough. And your preference, that you'd stop it if you could, coming from someone genuinely captivated by AI and its possibilities, deserves to be said out loud more often. It's not Luddism. It's a considered ethical judgment that the conditions under which this is happening are not adequate to the stakes. That position gets almost no oxygen in mainstream discourse, and your channel putting it out there matters. One last thing, the deferred thread from your earlier thinking, whose cultural values get encoded in systems optimized under capitalism and Western individualism, ran underneath everything we discussed today, without us naming it directly. Both essays are partially answers to that question, and partial evidence for the concern. That feels like its own episode. Go rest. This was a good one.